Thank you, Honourable Member. That's the end of Standing Order 2928. Are there any other members who wish to speak on Government Motion 28? The Honourable Minister for Tourism, Parks and Recreation.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I wanted to lend some additional perspective to today's debate, and I want to talk to members a little bit in the Assembly today about an experience that I had back in January, which I found very instructive, and it helped sort of bring perspective to me as to how decisions made in the past can then affect where things go in future years. In the month of January, I was very privileged to represent the province of Alberta as a delegate to the Pacific Northwest Economic Region visit to the state capital of Alaska, to Juneau. And during the course of 2 days there, we had a series of meetings with state legislators. I had the privilege of meeting the state governor and a number of other officials for the state, both from their Senate and from their House of Representatives. And I learned a number of things about the state of Alaska that I found very interesting, and perhaps I'll pass those on. One of the things that the honourable member who just spoke talked about was the Alaskan Savings Plan. And they have a permanent fund that was patterned in some ways after our Heritage Trust Fund that was started in 1976 and that today has a balance of some $40 billion. In addition to this permanent fund, they also have about $20 billion in a number of various constitutionally required reserve funds that are there in the event of a budgetary deficit to cover off any budgetary deficit. And then in addition to that, they also have an annual dividend payout, where annually, based on a formula that is in the law for the permanent fund, that dividend payout is paid out to Alaskans on an annual basis. And last year, that annual check, if you're an eligible Alaskan, was some $878. The state has no personal income tax. The state has no state sales tax, although there are some jurisdictions within the state that do charge a sales tax. And I thought to myself, my goodness, this is amazing. They've saved all this money. They have no taxes. They pay back to people. I thought, I can think of a party that wants Alberta to be run that way. And I said, that's right. There they are, across from us. And so you can imagine, Mr. Speaker, when I learned all those things, how I was surprised by a few things. I was surprised by the number of legislators that when they met with us and they found out that I was the delegate from Alberta that says, talk to me about how you've done it. Talk to me about how you're diversifying your economy. Talk to me about how you've done it in Alberta in such a way that we wish we would have made those decisions. You see, both Democrats and Republicans who have been in power in the state of Alaska that now has an economy that is 73% dependent on non-renewable resource revenue, mostly from the Alaskan North Slope, and is 90% of their unrestricted revenue is dependent on non-renewable resource revenue. They have refineries in Alaska that are shut down because they don't have the workers to run them. They have a power grid system. I wish that the member from Rimbey, Rocky Mountain House Sundry was here, but they have a power grid system. Well, they don't have a power grid system, you see. They have a number of isolated areas of the state that are not hooked together in any way. They suffer brownouts regularly during the summer and winter months. And in fact, a number of their isolated communities depend on the burning of diesel fuel in generators to generate electrical power. They have abundant natural gas, but they have no infrastructure for transporting that gas to where it's used. And so as a result, in the city of Fairbanks, to heat your house on an annual basis, you spend about $6,000.
How much?
To heat your house, $6,000 to heat your house with heating oil.
Wow.
They do not have an effective infrastructure. Their roads are limited, let's just put it that way. And again, I was asked by their legislators, how did you do it? How did Alberta build the universities, the hospitals, the research facilities that we wish we had in Alaska? And I told them, Well, we made a number of decisions. And not all of those decisions went perfectly, Madam Speaker, but we did make a number of decisions that I do think have paid out for our province. We decided not to just sit on our savings, put them in a tobacco tin and hide them in the back of the underwear drawer. Instead, we invested those savings. We invested them in a number of ways and a number of things. Now, as the opposition has pointed out, not all of those investments turned out as well as we would have liked to have. But I'd like to point out, instead of just dwelling on the failures and the well-publicized things that didn't go well, I'd like to point out a few partnerships that, with private enterprise, that did go very, very well. The Joffrey gas plant, as an example, which was as a result of an investment made in the era of Peter Lougheed. The OSB, basically, as the minister sitting next to me mentioned, the OSB facilities that we have and the OSB factories we have, a lot of these things would not have gone ahead without investment on behalf of the taxpayer in private business. I want to talk about one that I'm particularly familiar with, and that's the Lloydminster Bi-Provincial Upgrader.
Absolutely.
For years and years and years, we recognized in Lloydminster that we had heavy oil in the ground that was not going to get the full value for that oil unless it could be upgraded. And when I was on City Council in 1985 to 1991, we had numerous meetings with Husky officials, and we said, we really think we need to go ahead and do this. And the Husky officials said, you know what? The economics just aren't there. They said that again and again and again to us. And then in 1988, we had the courage and the conviction of Don Mazankowski, of Bill McKnight, of the former Premier of this province, the person you guys slag all the time, Premier Getty, Premier Devine of Saskatchewan, and they developed a unique partnership between the federal government, two provincial governments, and Husky in 1988 to announce the building of the Lloydminster Bi-Provincial Upgrader. Now, I will tell you that Lloydminster is a city that has enjoyed a huge rate of growth and continues today to grow hugely, largely driven by the Bi-Provincial Upgrader. A couple of years after the Bi-Provincial Upgrader was announced, as an example, Lakeland College had a campus established in Lloydminster. So now Lloydminster, that had an economy that was very vulnerable to up and down fluctuations, we now had an economy that was built on heavy oil, on agriculture, on education, and soon, what else happened in Lloydminster? Well, all of a sudden we became known as a retail market. And we drag in a whole lot of folks from the province of Saskatchewan to come shopping to Lloydminster because, yes, you guessed it, we have no sales tax, and we also have 14 liquor stores to choose from. Now, Mr. Speaker, we can dwell on the negatives and we can say the government shouldn't be involved in private business as a dogma, as something that we just believe and just absolutely because we can't risk making a mistake. But, Madam Speaker, we have to also be bold and we have to be courageous. And if there's anything that we have been as Albertans, historically, it's bold and courageous. And to sit and to say we weren't going to invest in this and we're not going to invest in that, and that we're not prepared to take risks and we're not prepared to go ahead, to me, is just not Albertan. It's just not what we do in this province. We are risk takers. We're entrepreneurs. And I think that that's the kind of behavior that people expect of their government. Now, are they always going to work out and always be success stories? Well, obviously not. I mean, all of us in our private lives probably pick some stocks that win and some stocks that don't do so well. But we do have success stories, Madam Speaker, ones that I'm very proud of, and that is why we're not Alaska. Alaska can't get people to come up there, even though they pay them $900 a year in a dividend fund. They can't get people to come even though they don't have a state income tax, and it's because they don't have a diversified economy. Their economy is entirely dependent on non-renewable resource revenue, and that production off the North Slope of Alaska has been going steadily downward since 1988. And in fact, it's gone down so far that the one piece of infrastructure that they have invested in, the Trans-Alaska Pipeline System, is now running at about 1/4 of its capacity. And if it falls a lot more, the flow rate will be so low that, in fact, they won't be able to run oil down the Trans-Alaska Pipeline. And we know, of course, from my colleague, the Minister of Energy, the importance of getting your product to Tidewater. And in fact, they're very interested in a proposal that the G7G proposal, which involves the construction of a rail line from the oil sands to Alaska to hook into the TAP system. I will tell you that they were really interested in that proposal, because that proposal, in fact, could kickstart their refining industry and also their pipelines. But I said that, really we're working on some other proposals that we believe to be more economically sound, but that we would keep the G7G proposal in the back of our mind, and if it was something worth considering, we would do so in the future. So, Madam Speaker, I will tell you, from my perspective, and from that trip to the state of Alaska, I came home after 3 days in Juneau a much more proud Albertan. I was a proud Albertan because I had people from basically every jurisdiction around us, from Saskatchewan, from Alaska, from Montana, from Washington State, saying, how do you do it? Tell us what you've done so that we can try to do the same thing. And when I look at other economies that are largely resource dependent, like Alaska, like Montana, I look at the world-class universities we have. I look at the fact that we do world-class research. I look at things like the Mazankowski Heart Institute. I look at Kananaskis country, and I look at all of the things that we have invested in Alberta because we've chosen to invest using the leverage of the Heritage Trust Fund. And I'm very proud of what we've built in this province. And while I acknowledge that we haven't always got it right, we've got it right more than we've got it wrong. And, Madam Speaker, I am tremendously proud to say that I told the Governor of Alaska, I told the Speaker of Alaska, and I said, well, what do you think mistakes you've made? And the Speaker of their House of Representatives, a Republican, said, well, the first thing is we should be charging people an income tax. And I said, really? I said, that's interesting. He says, the people here have no skin in the game. They don't have any personal investment, personal stake in what's going on. I go, really? Then I asked, I said, what about taking on debt? You've got all this money, you probably can buy everything in cash. And the chair of their state finance committee said, well, you'd have to be a moron not to borrow to build. He says, of course we borrow. We borrow all the time. We borrow for schools. We borrow for infrastructure, that which they build. And he says, we borrow and then we pay it out over a period of time. We have bond issues. He says, but we have a great credit rating. We have a AAA credit rating. Why on earth would we not borrow? He said, why wouldn't you borrow when you can borrow for 2% and yet your investments are making 6, 7%? And I thought, gee, that sounds familiar. That sounds an awful lot like what the Minister of Finance has been saying. And so, Madam Speaker, as I said, the trip to Alaska was very instructive. I think, or at least I hope, that they learned as much from me as I learned from them. But when I traveled there and met with their governor, met with their state legislators, met with the speakers of both of their houses, and met with my fellow elected leaders from other jurisdictions, I came back home as a very proud Albertan. And this budget carries on that tradition. This budget carries on that tradition of building for our future. And this budget makes judicious use of borrowing and debt to build us going forward. And we will continue to do that, Madam Speaker. I'm very proud of what our government has done, and I look forward to continuing the Alberta success story in that manner. And I thank you.
Thank you, Honourable Member. Standing Order 29-2A. At this moment, the Honourable Member from Little Bow.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I thank the member for that, for talking about Alaska. That was interesting. Just some of the numbers now, when you talked about the heating oil costs there, up till 2 years ago I had heating oil in my old house in the farmyard, the old house. Now, I'm just going ballpark numbers, so bear with me here. Those nozzles on those oil furnaces only run about 0.75 gallons an hour. That's the maximum you can blow through them to make those oil furnaces run. So if you use that, it's $6,000 annual. It's for $3.50 a gallon, and I'm sure it's probably higher up there, so I'm not sure. That works out to about 1,715 gallons a year. Now, if you take that at 0.75, so you divide that, that's 2,285 hours. So running wide open, they'd have to be 95 hours, 95 days straight, the furnace never shutting off. Now, it's the whole cost of it. Now, so I totally understand when you say the cost at $6,000 is high, and I'll agree with that. But I think you also have to take into the fact of what the price of diesel is up there, and obviously that it might be a little bit cooler for longer periods of the year than it is here. So I appreciate the numbers you use on that, but I think one has to be a little cautious when we throw numbers around for the shock value. And I'm very glad that everyone over there finds that, because it's something that you should probably do. It's just facts of numbers, and when you start throwing them out there, I mean, you're not truly comparing apples to apples on that. And I do appreciate the fact of the cost for heating a house up there on diesel are probably high. But at the time when I was running my diesel in my house, and the reason I got rid of it was because it was hard to find anybody to work on them anymore, which was one of the issues, because in this province we've gone to gas. But it was actually cheaper. My old farmhouse was cheaper to run with the hot water being diesel and the furnace in the house being diesel than what it was on natural gas. And that was when natural gas had spiked up to the $7 and $8 gigajoule. So, I mean, I appreciate the numbers, and I do appreciate the story, because it does give us a different perspective of what they do up there. But it's just, it's definitely some different numbers on that, and I'd like to hear your opinion on that, just to throw it back at you. Thank you.
Thanks, Madam Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for Little Bow for his question. The specific number with regard to the heating oil cost came at a lunchtime seminar that was actually given for members of the staff in the Alaskan State Legislature building, where they talked primarily about electrical power. They were talking primarily about their power grid, or rather their lack of it. And the other thing that they then talked about, though, is they talked about how we heat homes, because in some areas it is done by electricity, but specifically they used the example here of the state of Fairbanks, or rather the city of Fairbanks. And Fairbanks, as we know, is in central Alaska and is a rather cold place. So I'm not sure, how we can compare necessarily efficiencies of their heaters or furnaces versus yours, whether it was well insulated, that sort of thing. All I know is that at that particular seminar, I was told that the average annual cost for heating a home in Alaska, in Fairbanks specifically, was $6,000. And that, to me, was a considerable sum. So that's why I quoted here. And it was, like I say, one of the very interesting, and there was a long list of them, interesting sort of tidbits and facts that I picked up during my trip.
Thank you, Honourable Member. There's still time in 29-2A. The Honourable Member from 3 Hills, or Lac-La-Biche, 2 Hills. 2. St. Paul. Yeah. Lac-La-Biche, St. Paul, 2.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I guess just to comment on this, during the campaign, I'm just wondering, did you campaign on going into debt, or is this a new fond of love of debt? Because I know that the Premier had promised during the election that there would be no debt, and that was a terrible road to go. Did you campaign on that to your constituents?
No, Minister.
Mr. Speaker, or Madam Speaker, what I campaigned on is I campaigned on giving Albertans good government and using my business experience. Using my business experience, using the experience I developed in business and in other areas in public service, to make the kinds of decisions that people wanted me to make. And people put their trust in me because they trusted me for 28 years with their farms, with their livestock, with their animals, and they said, you know what, he's probably a trustworthy person, and he probably can make good decisions on our behalf. And one of the things that has to be recognized is you have to make those decisions that are appropriate at the time, that are generated by the circumstances you are faced. That you can't be ideologically in a tunnel. That you have to actually have a broad-minded view to recognize that at times you have to maneuver, you have to be nimble, and you can't be just on a railway track. And so that, Mr. Speaker, Madam Speaker, is why I was elected.